meantime, Isaac Wright standing by with us, former executive director of Correct the Record, a pro-Clinton super PAC, and Chris Wilson, a former campaign pollster for Senator Cruz and a partner at WPA Opinion Research, one of the largest Republican polling firms. It's great to have you both. We really want to talk about tax reform and health care because that affects all of us, all of our viewers. But it's interesting, we're experiencing the same thing that the White House is, Chris, which is that even though we want to talk about some of these really key issues to our everyday lives, this intel story keeps on rising to the surface. And that's why I started with Catherine Herridge out of the press briefing, because a lot of the questions were on that. How much is this issue over the Intel Committee and over this particular story about who knew what when really dogging the Trump administration and their attempts to try to control the agenda and the things that they would actually like to accomplish?
Well, I think you saw that represented in the press conference, what Sean Spicer just said. I mean, the fact is that it continues to dominate the news cycle, and it's unfortunate because it does distract from other aspects of what they're trying to accomplish. And I would just say to the Trump administration and everyone around them, it's important that they cooperate and do so publicly, because the quickest thing, the best thing for their agenda and for the Republican Party as a whole agenda is to get this behind them and be able to move forward, because otherwise it's going to continue to be a distraction and take away from things like pushing health care, pushing healthcare reform, pushing infrastructure bill, pushing tax reform, and it's just it's problematic on several levels.
Isaac, I'm guessing, I know you and Chris probably don't agree with a lot, but I'm guessing you agree a little bit with him on that about, and the Trump administration said through the press secretary there, fine, have Yates testify, let's get it all out. Do you believe that?
Well, there's certainly been comments today already that Nunes canceled the hearing in order to prevent her from testifying. We don't know. There are a lot of moving pieces to all of this, and there are a lot of questions about our national security and the credibility going back to the Trump administration and their dealings with Russia. And we certainly want to have a fair and thorough probing of that to know where we are and where we stand as we battle the big issues and tackle the big issues facing our country.
Well, and so there we go. We all looking for facts, so we can all agree on that. That's great. So we actually don't have the facts, which is why I can't talk more about it. We're waiting for more facts, so we're going to wait. In the meantime, Chris, let's talk a little bit about tax reform. We heard from the press secretary, middle-class tax cuts could be coming, corporate tax rates cut as well. There is a question about whether or not the Trump administration links that tax reform to infrastructure and tries to push something really big through. Do you think that'd be wise? Would that be beneficial for the American people?
Well, gosh, this is where you get into the drain the swamp aspect, because there's so many components that fit into it. I'll speak to it first of all about what needs to be done for a process of actually being successful, because I think if there's one lesson that we can take away from healthcare reform is if the Republican Party and the leadership and the Trump administration don't bring in the middle of the party and the right of the party from the outset, then they're almost destined for failure from the beginning. You can't just present something to the Republicans in Congress that are elected officials and say, hey, just pass this because it's coming down from us. That will not work. The other aspect of it is there are so many landmines that are going to exist in this, no matter how they go about it. If they do tax reform, you have lobbyists and people who want to make sure that they're protected. And then if you do the infrastructure reform, you have groups that want to make sure that they get the contracts coming out of that. I mean, there are so many aspects to this that make it a difficult road to hoe that I think it is incumbent upon the White House to, again, learn from what went wrong in health care, work with conservatives, work with moderates, work with those Democrats who are willing to work with Republicans from the outset to make sure they have a bill that is a little more acceptable once it arrives.
Isaac, I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you think that there are some willing Democrats to work with the White House on an issue like tax reform?
Well, I think where we agree on the issue of what President Trump has talked about for tax reform as well as for infrastructure is that there's significant obstacles. Where we would disagree is I think the major obstacle is arithmetic. The math just isn't there. Donald Trump, the tax plan he outlined during the campaign would provide massive tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans at the expense of very little for the middle class. And the plan to fund that largely came from throwing about 20 million or more Americans off their health care. And so without the ability to throw those Americans off their health care, where would they pay for that? And where would they pay for the $1 trillion proposal by President Trump for infrastructure expenditures? Remember, the Republican U.S. senators in 2011 voted down Barack Obama's stimulus package that for infrastructure that was 1/10 the size of President Trump's.
They would argue it was structured differently, but Isaac, you summed up so perfectly the Democrats' opposition to this sort of tax reform, Chris. So what is your response to Isaac, who says, hey, listen, there's real issues here?
Well, I think you've got to look back at history. I mean, two of the largest periods of economic growth have been brought about by the tax cuts of JFK, John F. Kennedy back in the 60s, by Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And let's take those Reagan tax cuts as an example. They would not have happened without Phil Gramm, a Democrat member of Congress at the time, being a part of pushing them through. And I really hope that you'll see a more reasonable Democratic Party than we've seen of late.
I'm going to have to run, but Isaac, I'm going to give you last word. Is there a Democrat like that that Chris is describing? Is he or she out there?
I think there are Democrats who are ready to talk about tax reform, but whereas the Trump tax cut that he proposed during the campaign would give a 1% rebate, essentially like $500 in tax cuts to those making $40,000 to $50,000 a year, and $315,000 or a 30% of their own money back for those making over $1 million a year. It's about those priorities, and we want to see help for the middle class.
Isaac, Chris, great to have you both. Really appreciate the conversation and look forward to having you both back on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.